Well, kia ora, te whānau. If my count is getting anything like accurate, we're up to about number 7 of these talks about the gold rush. So I just want to talk to you about a study that I did as part of my thesis, and it absolutely blew me away. And it's published as an article called "A Petty and Spiteful Spirit on the Part of the Company, the 1881 Cromwell Company Strike at Bendigo." But originally this presentation, before it was turned into a journal article, was called "One of These Ruins is Not Like the Others." And so I just want to talk about the fact that if you look at Bendigo, now I based my whole PhD on Bendigo for two reasons. One is it's an amazing place, and two, I needed an exemplar, and why not use your favourite? You're going to spend 3.5 years studying something, make it something you enjoy. So it's quite significant. The cultural, archaeological, cultural and heritage landscape is significant in terms of the number and variety of standing structures, their state of preservation, the size of the reserve, and the sheer picturesque nature. I mean, it's a magnet for photographers. There's dozens of house remains, hotel sites, quartz crusher, battery foundations, and numerous adits, shafts, test pits, and mullock piles. And they all basically describe in visual essays the energy and work of the miners. But amongst all of them, there's one ruin is not like the others. And it's constructed from carefully placed and faced stone on each of two faces. So what they would do is build one face here and one face here, and as they went up, that would be rubble filled. Now, interestingly enough, this same technique was used to build castles and things like that. So whoever built this had some skill. It had tie blocks going through, so it's not like you had two facades. These were actually tied together, and there's the remains of lining plaster adhering to the internal wall. And yet, so you can see the plaster that remains there. So they rendered it. They made it look nice. And despite just how beautifully and well it's made, it's a ruin. And right across the floor in front of it is the scattered stone that obviously made up part of it. Now, by contrast, there are these, well, if you excuse the phrase, quite crappy little cottages that are stood. I mean, these have been built. We know these were built in about somewhere between 1860, probably 1864, 65, with gusts up to maybe 1870. No later than that. And yet these stone ruins have stood and still stand at Bendigo for, 150, 160 years? And this one is in pieces. So, and by the way, there's no mortar used in any of these. I mean, they are held together with mud mortar, and the ruined part has not tumbled down. Now this photo actually shows it even clearer. You can see these massive tie blocks that give the whole structure strength and stability. But it's all collapsed. It wasn't wrecked, not by vandals. There'd been enough vandals around Bendigo, including those muppets called bottle collectors. But its debris is scattered over. You can see the lighting kind of changes here because I've been taking photographs of this place for 30 years. But these stones are scattered sort of evenly across the landscape. And it's wrecked from a little known series of events from 1881. Now, the archaeologists record it as site number 124/308 and 309, but I've always treated the two as contiguous. Now, I don't know why they've done this, but this all very clearly, if you have a look at the actual site, for one thing, it's turned on this part here has largely disappeared, but there was also a, this is the parts that you can see that remain. They're almost certainly one structure with outbuildings. It's shown on the Mackay map of 1876 as a house and garden located at the northwest corner of one of the two Cromwell Quartz Mining Company leases. And it's that location that's going to cause a problem. So with quartz leases, they were linear along the line of the quartz vein. So here is one lease, and then they had a break because they thought there was none there, and then they had the other one, and then later they came back and organised one of the company shareholders to own that lease as a separate thing called the Golden Link, because as luck would prove, that's where the most spectacular gold was ever found. And so this is on the lease. The company owned the lease and paid the provincial government and then eventually the national government, small n, to mine for gold. They had to, when you took out a lease, you had to do a survey, and these were defined boundaries. Very accurate, by the way. The surveying is a very old profession, and it was well done. And so you paid for a survey, you paid for registration of the lease, and you had to work your lease to maintain it. In other words, the Dauntless Quartz Mining Company, QM Quartz Mining, and Great Britain, which actually operated quite a decent mine at one point, to keep your lease going, you had to have a minimum, you had to specify on your lease, but normally it was 2 or 3 men continuously working. By continuously, I mean 40 hours a week, not 24 hours a day. This view comes from Kevin Jones's photography of the area, and it's just there. So what you've got, this is a farm road. It's not the original road. The original road actually goes this way. And there's the northern lode, the number 2 shaft. So one of the things that's intriguing is we've got another really impressive house, and you can see here, this is William Pengelly builds this in 1882 for himself. He's a Cornishman, and that's the back view of the same one. But that's a really impressive house, same technique, identical technique. So how come one has fallen down and the other one is not? And excuse me, I'll turn the page. I'm keeping to my notes here for 2 reasons. One is there's a lot of detail on this that I just forget if I don't, and 2, it keeps me on track. So what makes this different? What makes this ruin different to the rest of the Bendigo area? Well, some background. First of all, there's up to 52 quartz claims operated at Bendigo at any one time. Most lasted just a few months. There were some lasted several years, and one, the Cromwell Company Quartz Mining Company, provided both profit and longevity. The first 4 shareholders were Thomas Logan, Jack Garrett, Brian Hebden, and George Goodger, and they did it really hard. They found decent gold in 1866. They starved till 1869 when the first gold started coming through. They were supported by a local storekeeper by the name of Perium at just up the road at Loburn, and they were getting a consistent, basically for the first decade of operation, about between an ounce and a half of gold per stone. They had the opportunity to basically cash up in 1872 and then properly cash up in 1876. And only George Goodger maintained a shareholding. And but what had happened is there'd been a change to financing. Instead of financing being only through miners combining their resources, they brought in the no liability clause in company investing. We'd call it limited liability now. And it enabled Dunedin investors. Dunedin did really, really well out of the gold era. Still looks amazing, the architecture in that. But they basically in 1876 the money men came in and the original shareholders disappeared. In 1872 Brian Hebden returned to Yorkshire and his remarried, because he married in at Bendigo, but his wife died a year later, so that was one of the reasons he left. So what happened was the gold started pinching out. This is a survey done in 1906 when the deep parts were actually flooded at this point. But they basically started to run out of payable stone. So they took on someone to reorganise the mine. This fella here, Charles Todd, he's appointed manager in 1878. Now, two things he did. One, introduced what we would now call health and safety. He tightened up really tight on the rules that miners had to follow to actually operate. He effectively did not want miners breaking legs, breaking arms, dying, because all those happened. This was one of the safer mines in Otago, but the fact is they still had significant injuries in that. He brought in a really tough regime, and if you broke the rules, he fired you. He had no hesitation. And they spent a year where they said to all the shareholders, listen, you're going to have to take a hit because we're going to expand the mine. What we'll do is we're going to go deeper. We'll dig some horizontal, these are called adits when they're horizontal. Don't call them tunnels. Tunnels have a hole at each end. An adit has a hole at one end. We'll dig some winzes, that's the link between the two levels. We'll dig extra levels and we'll go deep. What he effectively did was allow the expansion of the mine so that from there they could start looking and strike new veins of gold. And it was successful. Basically, after a year of work, the mine was profitable again. And he tripled the work area, but once they had found the payable stone, he got rid of about 40 of the miners. And in March 1880, 40 miners were gone. The workforce sort of crept up again to about 50. They tended to sort of go down to a low of 30 and then up to 80 was the most I've ever found. But there were monthly dividends being paid. And for shareholders, that was very welcome. And there was a consistent, profitable ounce per gold, per tonne of stone. And given that this was profitable, it begs the question why. Right when things are going well, the shareholders arbitrarily cut miners' wages. It was very interesting. As soon as they cut wages, every other mine in the region cut their wages too. But the miners were served with notice. Now, they did not have unions then. If you look at our union history, we do not have any significant union activity going on at this point. Australians were coming over and trying to organise our labour, and we were just doing the New Zealand, thing in response to it. So the significant strikes are not going to happen until we get to Denniston in the 1890s, and then the really big one that involves gold miners up at Waihi in 1913 that will end up in a death. But all the miners club together and they start working together, and they agree, we are not going to go to work while the wages are cut. Simultaneously, so this newspaper advert appears in the Cromwell Argus, it appears in the Otago Daily Times, and in the Dunstan Times. So, Dunstan Times published in Clyde. Same newspapers, this ad appears. Cromwell Quartz Mining Company, Bendigo. We want truckers, that's the people who move. They had little sort of mini railways and carriages on these that you push out with the stone in it, and miners on 9 shillings and 8 shillings 6 pence per day. So they are advertising this reduced amount, and the idea is they're emphasising steady employment. And it was, see, there've been other I suppose other conflicts, and each time no one had really dug their toes in. Like to get down to 10 shillings a day, they were on 11 and they cut it. But I think when that happened, the miners sort of saw that things were tough and that they would stay employed if they take the cut. But they knew when the wages are cut here, this is a profitable mine. We no longer have to go, oh, we're all going to sort of take a bit of a hit, the shareholders and us as well. No. Shareholders are getting monthly dividends, and suddenly they cut the wages. So a miner writes in the Cromwell Argus, this was so bitter that the Cromwell Argus gets thrown in in about 1970 something, the bound copies of the Cromwell Argus get thrown into the Clutha so that this sort of thing can't be found. They didn't realise there was other copies around. But anyway, Cromwell miner writes, a Bendigo miner writes that the strike will continue an indefinite period unless the men are employed at the former wage. And the Otago Witness reports that other miners who might have been expected to show up and seek employment were not doing so. Now, I contend, Reviewer B, in my peer-reviewed journal article about this, would not let me say what I'm about to say, but I'm going to say it because this is my channel. This was the first site-wide industrial unrest that wasn't a public works scheme. In other words, it wasn't a government scheme in New Zealand. In our history, the whole site walked off non-union. And it turned really bitter though. Manager Todd gets a threatening letter, or it said, beware, beware, beware. And he took that as a threat. And there was a length company Fluming found damaged. The police investigated and unusually wore sidearms. And the miners were absolutely incensed. I mean, it was like, why the heck are you wearing guns? You know, we're not going to start attacking anyone. And they basically said there's no sabotage. That bloomin' Fluming was going to collapse anyway, and the fact that it's collapsed is just coincidental. And these threats brought in a tactic by the company that created a lasting bitterness. Now, this is the only time I have found in any industrial conflict involving personal houses in our history, ever. Each miner was given a letter. I am instructed by the legal manager of the Cromwell Company to inform you that you have to remove your house from the company's ground within 6 days from date, and in the event of you not complying, you'll pay basically 10 shillings a week and 15 shillings a week 2 weeks after that. And signed by Charles Todd. The houses would have to be pulled down and the reassembled off the lease. So here's the lease. Now, this cottage, probably the most photographed cottage at Bendigo, that's fine, it's just here. It's way out of the lease. This one, same thing. We know that. So we know where these houses are. But look, running right through the middle of that house there is the lease boundary. A miner wrote to the Herald, which was an evening paper, and they said, few of us had any means of paying rent for the privilege of living in our own houses. In other words, what the rent was, miners weren't particularly well paid, but they didn't have to pay rent. They basically built their own houses and lived there. To suddenly start paying 20% of your income as rent was just something they couldn't do. And they made the point that in one house there was a young mum with her firstborn, and they described how the husband's mates carried the roof off their comfortable house and placed it on other walls. Comfortable house. These were not shacks, they weren't slums, they were comfortable. And then the Otago Daily Times, which had a habit of editorialising quite strongly, it would in 1883 with the Sweating Commission. That's an interesting topic to look up in New Zealand history. But anyway, it said disappointment is felt at the order, showing a petty and spiteful spirit on the part of the company. That was so good I used it for the title of this article. And this narrative was published in both the Star and Otago Witness, and it must have made the Scottish and Irish readers very uncomfortable, because identical words to that used by to describe the company's actions at Bendigo described the Highland clearances 50 years earlier, and had been recently, and when I say recently, within 6 months, in the London Illustrated News narrative of the Irish Land League evictions. What was interesting, the miners had no recourse to violence. They were not violent people. The spirit of Eureka and all that sort of thing was gone. You know, they weren't in the habit of fighting. This is one of the photos from the Illustrated London News, and the narrative that goes alongside it. The scanty furniture rudely cast out upon the ground, the weeping wife and daughter, the terrified babies, the poor old father apparently stunned by this great affliction. So, and the same language is being used of a New Zealand company. The Otago Daily Times notes also that one stone building was taken down stone by stone and rebuilt outside the boundary by some 40 of the strikers. I'd really love to know which one was it. Was it one of these? But you know, you wander around and try to think, well, what looks newer? Well, they're all 150 years old, so. So this house here is really substantial. Now, why was it ruined? Well, you're not just going to pick up the roof and shift it, because that's a nice house, that's a big house. You don't want some twat manager suddenly going, oh, well, that's a very nice house, I think I'll live in there, and putting a roof back on and carrying on. This was actually wrecked. Now, we know that it would have been quite difficult to build. We know that it was sufficiently well built that it would have survived as well as Pengelly's house. And I find it interesting they left part of it up. I reckon, this is my theory, they left that up because every time the miners had to walk past it to head towards the current shaft they were sinking, they had to walk past that. And it's kind of like a reminder those guys that are paying you are not very nice people. And what was interesting, though, is in the brinkmanship that characterised this dispute, the owners blinked first, and at the end of August there was a meeting of the shareholders. They decided to reverse the wage cuts and resume mining. And there was a last blast in this where they said, a miner wrote, "Now if there's one place in New Zealand where kindly feelings should exist between employer and employed, that place is Bendigo. It's always been the case heretofore." Now, to be fair, when the mine first started, the 3 out of the 4 shareholders lived at Bendigo, went underground, did the mining, knew what they were doing. George Goodger was a hotel owner. He was the main financier back in Cromwell. But the other 3 lived there. If you watch the presentation I did on the cottages of the gold rush, then you'll find the instance where Thomas Logan's little hut is known. I assert that the Cromwell Company will never recover the loss sustained in the removal of men from their employee whose equals cannot be caught in New Zealand. Now, what was interesting was the miners made it blue. They went out collectively, but to sign up again, they went back to Todd one by one. And Todd was not a stupid man. Basically, some of these fellas found that miraculously there were no jobs for them. So there was about a turnover of about 3/4 of the miners there. But I like the fact that this was said about Bendigo, because that's the old stamper battery there. It's basically lying there in ruins. Because what happens is within a year, returns fall. They start falling and continue falling. 1882 and 1883, the value of the shares plummet. There's one parcel that when it was first bought was valued at £1,120 when it was used as security in 1882, and it was worth, quote, a few shillings in 1884. The company is then sold with the whole mine and plant knocked down to an investment syndicate for £1,075. £1,075. Just to put that in perspective, they had a 20-head stamper battery just there. The 20-head stamper battery, a 4-head stamper battery cost about £1,200. So they got everything for £1,075. There was a skeleton staff kept on, because if you stop working a mine, it fills with water, and that becomes very dangerous. You may have seen that Australians had the technology to de-water a mine, which was when water had come up, they would just pump it out and carry on mining. Well, that's fine, because they used Australian hardwoods in the subterranean parts. In New Zealand, if you use native timbers, New Zealand timbers, and the mine floods, the timbers actually turn to about the strength of an egg carton, just turn to mush. And so you have to, if you want to reopen a mine, you have to re-timber that mine, which is incredibly dangerous. In fact, you actually don't do it. The best timbering of mines were done with Jarrah timber brought over from Australia. There's not been a single instance of reopening a New Zealand mine that was timbered with New Zealand timbers, unless they go to open cast, which has been done. Ron Murray, lovely man, suffered from the effects of polio, which didn't really limit him much. He used to go shooting and riding horses and driving his car all over. He said to me, none of us can write about this. He lived in Cromwell in Inniscourt Street all his life. And he said to me, we can't. There are people from both sides of that strike still in town, and we remember it. He said, basically, we need someone brave enough, I took that to mean stupid enough, to actually write about it. And he said, you need to do it. So I did. And so this is the only time ever where my impetus to write was not some information I found, but just this atypical ruin where it just didn't look right, and I investigated and found that one of these ruins is not like the other. And that one there is the example of a house that was ruined as a result of a strike. So thanks for listening, and I can't remember what the next title's going to be, but a remote quartz mining valley. I'll give you a history of a place that I studied, and it has this vast, long history that, I found fascinating anyway. Anyway, catch you, bye.